It is my pleasure to introduce the ranking member of the House Budget Committee, Congressman Chris Van Hollen, Democrat of Maryland. His district, which borders D.C., is home to huge numbers of government workers. We want to talk to the Congressman about taxes, about income inequality, and the future of work. And here to ask the questions is Stephen Rattner. He's a financier who advised the president on the auto industry in 2009. He's chair of the private investment group Willett Advisors and an analyst for MSNBC's Morning Joe. Take it away, Stephen.
Thank you. So we do want to get deeply into these important matters that the Congressman has worked very hard on. But before we do that, what weighty matter was going on Capitol Hill this morning that commanded your attention?
Well, let me start by apologizing for running late, but votes got in the way, and unless you can talk to Speaker Boehner to rearrange the schedule, I was there to vote. So we were dealing with a piece of cybersecurity legislation that also engaged lots of privacy issues, and so that was the vote today on the floor.
I was hoping you were going to report to us that the gridlock had broken and you were passing all kinds of important legislation that's been
and
bottled
the skies
up.
Parted and everything else went well. But actually, just very briefly on that, there has been some progress, limited in the last couple of weeks. We passed something called the doc fix, the SGR, which is probably not a big hot issue outside of Washington, but we actually came up with a longer-term solution to that, and more recently in the Senate, we see some progress. But whether that's a sign of things to come, I think it's way too early to say.
And the other thing I think that seems to be happening is there seems to be an agreement between the Republicans and at least Senator Wyden, the ranking member of the Finance Committee, on the so-called fast track, or TPA. Most Democrats are opposed to it. I probably should have looked this up, but it wasn't the subject. But while we're talking about it, what's your view about TPA?
Sure. So my approach to a lot of these trade agreements has been to look at each one on the merits. And there were some of the bilateral trade agreements that I thought would increase jobs and increase incomes for Americans. I've been very concerned about the lack of congressional input into this most recent round of TPP negotiations, and in my view, the TPA legislation that was introduced does not address that shortcoming adequately.
Really, even though it has, I think, a 180-day process for consideration by Congress, and I think the administration has also said that the text of this agreement is out there and anyone who wants to read it can go read it.
Oh, and I've looked at the agreement. If you want to get into the agreement itself, I have some serious reservations and problems with provisions of the agreement. And
I was talking more of the process, but they have made the agreement available.
They have, although this is, look, I don't want to be critical of the administration in terms of the overall approach over the last couple of years, but I can tell you members of Congress have been incredibly frustrated about getting information with respect to the agreement.
So you'll be voting against the TPA?
TPA, yes.
Okay, fair enough. Let's turn to the broader economic situation, and you are the ranking member of the House Budget Committee, and you a few months ago released, I think, a very thoughtful and very comprehensive proposal to address a variety of economic issues that we're facing. Why don't you give everybody sort of the elevator version of what's in your proposal, and then we can drill down on some of these issues? Sure,
and I'll try to make it an elevator. How tall is the building for this elevator?
Washington height, not New York height.
Yeah. So very briefly, I think we all recognize we have a huge challenge in this country in trying to build an economy that grows rapidly with more shared prosperity. In fact, I think there's increasing evidence that the economy will grow faster if you have more shared prosperity. And at the same time, we've seen this yawning gap over the last really 30 years, where on the one hand you have rising worker productivity. It's been going up dramatically. And for a long period between the 50s and the late 70s, that rising worker productivity coincided with rising wages and benefits for workers. They pretty much overlapped if you were to map them. Around the late 1970s, you see this great divergence. You see worker productivity continue to rise, but that's not translating into higher wages and benefits for workers, and it also led to this growing income inequality. So most of the gains from that increased productivity flowed to folks at the very top. So my proposal is designed to address that. In one in one sense, through trying to change the tax code. And I know you've done a lot of writing and testifying on this, and I think we see eye to eye on a lot of these issues. But our current tax code is skewed in favor of sort of capital gains, people who are making money off of money. The tax rates for that kind of income are lower compared to tax rates for income through work and wages. So I think there are a number of things we need to do to change that. And I also think we can actually use our tax code more to incentivize higher wages and benefits, and I have a number of proposals to do that. So I'm happy to dive into details. I feel passionately about this.
Give us just a couple of details of what you know,
Sure.
because I've read this, but
Sure.
they don't all know what it is.
So we use our tax code for a lot of things that I think are totally unproductive provisions in the tax code that have gotten there, not because they make economic sense, but because you have a powerful interest that makes a particular argument. Lots of examples. One Steve's written about, and where I agree with him, is the carried interest issue for hedge funds. I mean, there's no reason that you should have a lower tax rate on that income than on the income earned by someone, working wages for a job. So there's lots of stuff in there that probably shouldn't be. I believe that we can make some creative changes, and here's one idea. Under our current tax code, if you're a corporation, you can deduct the bonuses or so-called performance pay that you pay to your employees over $1 million, right? So you pay a CEO a salary of $1 million, but if you provide $3 million in bonuses above that, you can do it, but you also get a tax deduction for it. And it's actually pretty sizable when you look at the value of these tax deductions. Over a 3-year period, 2007 to 2010, it reached almost $70 billion. These are deductions for CEO and executive bonuses. So what I've suggested is, why should we be providing those tax deductions for those bonus and performance pay if those corporations aren't giving their employees some of the benefit of the increasing productivity and gains? After all, if these guys are getting big bonuses, I'm assuming it's because the corporation's supposed to be doing pretty well, and you would assume, therefore, employees are contributing to that value. And so it's a pretty simple idea. You can pay your CEOs or executives whatever bonuses you want, but if you want a tax deduction for it, you got to be giving your employees wage pay increases that reflect increased productivity and inflation gains. So that chart I talked about at the beginning, where you have this big gap between worker productivity on the one hand and wages on the other, begins to close over time. So that's one idea for how we can use our tax code in a way that I think incentivizes the kind of economy that we want, rather than one that incentivizes a lot of unproductive activity.
Here's that chart in case anybody can see it from the back. But I have seen this chart, I've used this chart, and it's certainly true. But I think there are those who feel that there are a lot of forces at work that create this problem, not just the tax code or not just mean-spirited CEOs, but globalization and the competition from other countries that simply pay lower wages and have workers that increasingly can do the same quality of work. I saw this in the auto industry in Mexico. Auto workers make about $7.50 an hour. In the U.S., they can make as much as $60 an hour with benefits. And the Mexican auto workers are very productive, and that's why more auto plants are now being built in Mexico. So how would your proposal help a problem like that? Because you're simply raising costs for the domestic companies and maybe giving them more of an incentive to move jobs offshore.
Well, I would let me just say this: there are absolutely those forces at play, and we've seen those forces not just in the area of lower wage jobs overseas, which has led companies to offshore a lot of work. There are also important improvements in technology, which we all benefit from in the form of higher innovation and sometimes higher productivity, but displace workers. So there are those forces out there. Those forces have also contributed to a reduction, a weakening of the ability of unions, for example, to organize for those higher wages, right? If the company can just move overseas, that obviously weakens the bargaining power of a union. So we have to look at the world as it is and see what tools we have at our disposal to begin to address these issues. And what I'm suggesting is one tool. I also think that we need to incentivize more apprenticeship programs. I think we need to be really creative about our workforce skills and training. We're seeing some creative solutions between community colleges and companies and businesses, but I think we need to further incentivize those kind of activities and investments because they are good for workers, they will grow the business over time, and again, a lot more productive than some of the other things. I also believe, and there's been a number of recent studies that just came out by a number of economists that indicate that if you provide additional tax relief or benefits to lower and middle income workers, you actually grow the economy more quickly than the trickle-down theory would suggest that the trickle-down approach would grow the economy. And these have been a number of studies that came out really just in the last year that suggest that providing those, again, those tax benefits, not just good for those families, but also helps grow the economy.
Because it creates more demand? Because you're putting money in their pockets? Or what's the, I'm not sure I understand.
Because it grows more demand, and that the demand generated from that, then generates more economic activity. And if anyone's interested, we're going to be putting these studies up on some of our websites.
So it's a very ambitious plan. It includes a financial transactions tax, which would obviously not be beloved in my hometown of New York. It includes these credits for lower-income families and so on. And so as a process or a political matter, was this simply something you wanted to put forward to just have it out there, or do you think there's some way to actually get it implemented, even pieces of it?
I do think over time there are ways to get this implemented because I think there's a growing consensus in the country that this big problem with frozen paychecks is become a chronic issue for families. And people do feel like they're working harder than ever and not getting ahead. And when you look at the data and the graphs, you can understand exactly why that is the case, that they're feeling that way. And so obviously we have to deal with the world as it is with all the forces that you're talking about, but we should be using those tools that are within our control and disposal to address these things. So what I did propose was essentially a financial transaction tax. We call it a financial market trading fee, just to make it clear to everybody they're not paying a tax when they go, get their money out of the ATM machine. This is so for the trading of stocks and other financial instruments. And what we're proposing is actually something that the EU is looking at, and I would stress that it's important to do this in coordination with the other major financial markets. And what we see is that whenever someone in Europe talks about imposing a slight financial trading fee, everybody runs to them and say, you can't do that because all the trades will go to New York or Chicago. And then when you try and do it here in the United States, they say you can't do that because all the trades will go to London or elsewhere. You do need to do this in coordination, but I would point out that the London in the UK, you already have a 50 basis point transaction fee on certain stock transactions. What we're talking about would be aligned with the EU, which is about 0.1%, 10 basis points on a lot of transactions. And we would use some of the revenue generated from that to address some of these other issues of financial squeeze, expand the child and dependent care tax credit, provide for paycheck bonus for workers, to try to get at this disparity, this sort of what I would argue an economic inequity, and one that has no rationale in the real world between how we're taxing income from work versus income from investment. And so these are a number of ideas. I hope people will we'll take a look at them. And to answer your question, I do think as we head into this 2016 presidential election year, that these are exactly the kind of policies that people are going to be looking at and debating. And it's already been clear that out of the Clinton campaign anyway, they're exploring a number of these ideas that we're talking about here today.
It's a thoughtful package, and one of the things about it that I like is you also try to help it address the deficit issues as well. So it's a responsible package. I think on that note, this exercise in speed dating or interviewing has to come to a close. Lunch is, I gather, being served or about to be served. So thank you very much, Congressman.
Thank you.
For being with
Thank
us
you,
today.
Steve. Thank all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.